Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be doing a video that I've thought about for a very long time. Several years ago, I had a friend who took a class in college about Victorian literature, but the professor, for whatever reason, decided that Victorian books were too long, and so they mostly read poetry, a few short stories, and then they each got to choose a novel that they would write their final paper on. And to this day, I think about this, and I am so frustrated by it. Firstly, because the Victorian era is literally known for its novels. Like, this was the time period when the novel came into its own, and to just completely dismiss that, well, he even talked about it apparently in this class. But apparently that didn't convince him that maybe they should try to read a few novels. Second of all, it's completely not true. There are a lot of shorter Victorian novels that are very easy to get through. And honestly, even some of the longer ones that are pretty popular aren't necessarily so long that you can't read it in a class. I mean, the same friend of mine had taken another class that was, I think, just British literature over a certain amount of time. And in that class, they read Jane Eyre as one of their like 5 or 6 books that they read throughout the semester. And Jane Eyre, I would think, is kind of one of the longer Victorian works, but they were able to finish it and just be fine. So it totally bothered me, and it still does. This professor apparently was in his last year of teaching. He was a poetry person, so I understand that he was kind of like, I want to go out with what I want to do, basically. But it's just such a shame that all of these students were in that class, a class where they could have just found a love for Victorian literature, and they had that ripped away from them by someone who wasn't willing to trust them to be able to read books that maybe are a little bit longer, or was just not smart enough or didn't care enough to find all of these shorter Victorian works that are out there. So today, for those of you who maybe also feel like Victorian novels are too long, that you want some shorter options to get kind of dip your toes in a little bit, I have some options for you, and all of these are by popular authors. None of them are super obscure or anything like that. There's maybe one that's a little bit more on the obscure side, but it's still easy to get a hold of. It's not one that it's like out of print or anything. Most of them I have also read myself, although there is 1 or 2 that I have not read myself, but I'll mention that as we get into them. So let's just get right into this, starting with some of the heavy hitters, specifically, of course, Charles Dickens, the Brontes. If you wanted to read a Charles Dickens novel, you could obviously read A Tale of Two Cities, which is not very long. My copy is 360 pages. All of these books I'll be mentioning are under 450 pages. And even the ones that are closer to 450 are like super easy to read and get into. Obviously, a lot of these are also like under 300 pages. So wherever you are in the spectrum of seeing books as shorter or more middling sized. Anyway, this one is one I actually haven't read myself. I should mention that. But it's such a popular one and such a common one to be studied in school that, I mean, it's a really good place to start, I think, with Charles Dickens. Like I said, not very long. It follows both people in London and people in Paris during the French Revolution, as far as I am aware. And Dickens, being one of the most popular Victorian writers, is a good place, I would think, to visit in a class like this, or if you just want to dip your toes in Victorian literature in general. Honestly, I would also argue that Great Expectations is not very long compared to a lot of his other works, and I think it would be very doable for a class, at least. If you're only reading like 4 to 6 books in a semester, I think Great Expectations would be very doable for most English majors. But like I said, A Tale of Two Cities is very short, very easy to get to. Then, like I said, we have the Brontes, and if you didn't want to pick up Jane Eyre because it's too long for you, you could go for Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. This one's a bit longer than my copy, at least, of A Tale of Two Cities. Still under 450. I think it's just into 400 pages in my edition, although there are pictures throughout my edition, so that adds to the page count, of course. But yeah, it's not a very long book. I think most people who read this, it doesn't necessarily take them a terribly long time, and it's just wonderful. Like, if you want to have a solid discussion in a class, or just a solid discussion with any Victorian literature lover, if you're just starting into Victorian literature, this is a great one to read, because even if you hate it, most people have a very emotional reaction to this book, whether that be very much love or very much hate. So there's a lot to discuss, a lot to think about, and it's just a staple of Victorian literature and classic literature in general. So definitely one that is worth the time, and like I said, is one of the shorter Victorian works and one of the more popular ones as well. But if even Wuthering Heights was too long for you and you wanted something a little shorter but you still wanted something Brontë, you could do Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This copy is 214 pages, so a lot shorter than Wuthering Heights, and this one is a little bit more domestic, so some people may find it a little bit more boring, while others may really love it. That tends to be the consensus though, is that people really like it or at least enjoy it. I haven't met very many people or heard very many people say they actively dislike this book, so I just feel like, you know, for the most part people at least enjoy it, and it discusses some interesting class issues and domestic issues within the Victorian era, especially for women, which I find very fascinating, and allows insight for new to Victorian literature people or people in a class about Victorian literature. Another very popular Victorian author is Oscar Wilde, so you could read The Picture of Dorian Gray by him, or if you wanted to read one of his plays, that would work very easily as well. My copy of this is 229 pages, so again, pretty short, especially for a novel in general. And this one's very exciting. It has a lot of things to discuss, a lot of character dynamics that are very interesting, particularly for the time period. I apologize, I have not actually been describing what each of these books is about. This one follows a young man who is young and beautiful, and he's complimented on his beauty, and there's an artist who does a portrait of him, and this young man, Dorian Gray, decides that he wishes that he could switch places with this picture, because then he would be able to stay young and beautiful forever while the picture would grow old. And maybe or maybe not someone was listening and that wish is granted. And so it's a very interesting look at morality and time and experience and how all of that create a human being. And it's really well written and has a very exciting ending as well. So I think it would be one that would be great to read for a class or for your first time with Victorian literature, both because of the discussions that can be had and because it's just an entertaining book. Next, of course, we have Thomas Hardy, and honestly, you could probably choose most things by Thomas Hardy. He's one that wrote pretty relatively short books, especially for the time period. But I have chosen for this Far From the Madding Crowd because I feel like it's one that has probably one of the happier storylines for Hardy, but also very engaging characters, very interesting plot line, and interesting character dynamics. This book in particular follows a young woman named Bathsheba Everdeen and a young shepherd named Gabriel Oak, who early on in the book meet. They come to care for each other, and he ends up asking her to marry him, which she turns down, and then over time both of their fortunes change up a little bit. There is so much to talk about with this book, and honestly with a lot of Hardy's works, but I do feel like this one is a more popular one first of all, so I think it will do the job a little bit better than some of Hardy's more obscure works. It's not quite as long as Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is one of his other really big ones, as well as Jude the Obscure, although I think this one actually might be about the same length as Jude the Obscure, but I think Jude the Obscure is a lot more intense and sad than this one, and so I think this one's a little bit of a nicer place to start for most people. Out of this list, this one's probably the longest. I guess not quite. It's not quite as long, at least as far as page number, compared with my edition of Wuthering Heights, but it's 353 pages, so very doable, especially for a class or your first time with Victorian literature, and also just a really great read. Another big name in Victorian literature is George Eliot, and I think George Eliot would be an interesting one to add to a curriculum because her writing style and approach to certain topics is very unique, and so I feel like it would be nice to fit her in somewhere on a Victorian literature curriculum. And her shortest work, and honestly a work that is just generally not super long, is Silas Marner. This book follows an old man who puts value on this bag of gold that he's accumulated over time. He's had a difficult history. He's become very lonely, and so this bag of gold represents all of his life's work, it represents all of his hopes and dreams. But one day, this bag of gold goes missing, but something else ends up kind of taking its place after a while. style, and it's just a really touching story while also having a lot of depth to it that George Eliot just has a power to create within stories like this. And again, I think it's one most people would enjoy, if not totally love. And this one is actually probably the shortest of the ones I've mentioned so far, as this copy is 183 pages, so not even 200 pages for this one. Then if you want a sort of different genre, if you want more science fiction stuff, I actually have an author to recommend because most of his science fiction works are really short, and that is H.G. Wells. I have here The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is 125 pages, and then I have The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds in this, which is a bind-up of the both of them. And while the print is obviously really small and covers a lot of these pages, I mean, it's not gonna be that long. Both of them together in this edition, both of them together is 205 pages in this book, which, I mean, divide that by 2 plus like maybe 50 pages for each, so like 150 pages. So really not long at all, and it will give you a little bit of a taste of a different genre within Victorian literature, and honestly H.G. Wells is pretty entertaining overall. Even though I haven't like necessarily fallen in love with any of his, I have at least enjoyed myself, so that is an option as well. Briefly describing what each of these are about, The Island of Dr. Moreau follows a man who ends up on a very strange island where strange things seem to be occurring with the local animals and other beings there. The Time Machine, I actually don't know what it's about, but I assume it's about a time machine. I actually haven't read that one yet. The War of the Worlds is about an alien invasion from space, so you know, a lot to offer science fiction wise there. And my last one is an option if you wanted something a little bit different, something more of a mystery. You could of course go with The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is probably the most popular of the Sherlock Holmes books, which is why I mention it here. I actually haven't read this one. I've read the first 2 novels in the series, and that is pretty much it. But in this tiny edition, The Hound of the Baskervilles is 213 pages. This also includes The Valley of Fear in this particular edition of it. And yeah, so not long at all. It's definitely one of the longer Holmes novels, but still not very long, and could add a new depth to your experience or your class discussion if you're in a class. And even though I haven't read this one, I have liked what I've read of Sherlock Holmes so far, so definitely one I'd be willing to recommend. So that is it. Those are my recommendations for shorter Victorian works that you could try if you haven't touched Victorian literature very much, or if you happen to be a professor at some time in the future and you teach a Victorian literature class. These are possibilities. You don't need to tell your students that yes, Victorian era was the best time for the novel. It was the time where the novel was truly born as we know it today, but we're not going to read any of them. Well, you'll read one on your own if you just like whatever you want, but we're just not going to read any as a class because apparently they're too long, which they're not. Anyway, thank you for allowing me to make this video so I could kind of get this frustration off of my chest. Let me know down below some shorter Victorian novels that you really enjoy, as I would love to hear about it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful Victober, and I will see you next time. Bye!